There are wounds that don't bleed on the outside, but feel like cracks running through the soul. When someone you've trusted with your devotion, your emotions, your vulnerability hurts you, something inside you breaks. It isn't just sadness. It's a symbolic rupture, a gap between what you gave and what you received. I am Liz Rose, a relationship expert, author, and researcher of emotional dynamics between men and women. For years, I have studied attraction, male behavior, emotional intelligence, and the patterns that bring people together or drive them apart. Today, I want to share with you what I have learned through my research, my professional experience, and the thousands of stories I have encountered throughout my journey. In those painful moments, the most human instinct is to seek out the other person, to ask, to demand answers, to beg them to see you, to understand what they did. But as fair as that may feel, it's an enormous emotional risk, because if he isn't willing to see, to take responsibility, or to feel what you're feeling, you'll hear something far more painful in return. The echo of indifference, or worse, coldness dressed up as detachment. That urge to talk, to explain, to justify your wound is often not a moment of clarity. It's the desperate cry of someone seeking validation from a person who simply doesn't have the capacity to hold space for your truth. And trying anyway is a guaranteed path to emotional exhaustion. That's why I don't want to begin with a superficial formula for empowerment. I want to start with something far harder, but far more powerful. The decision to withdraw emotionally, not as punishment, not as manipulation, but as a sacred act of psychic protection. Silence is the first boundary. Your absence is the first sentence of your new story. Because as long as you keep explaining your pain to the person who caused it without care, you keep handing over the most valuable thing you have, your emotional energy. Withdrawing doesn't mean disappearing, it means returning to yourself. It means looking at that wound and saying, yes, it hurt, but I won't keep handing myself over to the same place where I was broken. One of the most common emotional traps in unbalanced relationships is the belief that if we explain our pain clearly enough, if we put our feelings into words with enough detail, the other person will finally understand, take responsibility, and change. But in many cases, especially when it comes to men who haven't developed deep emotional awareness, that simply doesn't happen. The mistake isn't in expressing what you feel. The mistake is doing it with the expectation that he will take it as a guide for transformation. In my research, I've found that many men don't process emotion from a reflective place. They respond to concrete stimuli and observable behavior. They don't pause to analyze your words, and they're rarely moved by your tears or by the intensity with which you try to explain how you feel. What they pay attention to instead is whether, despite everything you've said, you're still there. Because what truly makes a difference isn't the speech, it's the consequence. It's not how much you tell him it hurts, but whether your actions reflect that hurt. If you give him emotional access again after being hurt, if you keep texting him, if you keep responding as if nothing happened, the message he receives isn't your pain, it's your unconditional availability. And in many cases, that availability gets read as permission. The more visible your distress and the more uninterrupted your connection, the clearer it becomes to him that he can hurt you without real consequences. This is why withdrawing, stopping the explanations, cutting emotional contact without warning often has a far deeper impact than any lengthy conversation ever could. I'm not talking about manipulation or playing strategic games of silence out of revenge. I'm talking about recognizing that your dignity is worth more than any attempt to be understood by someone who doesn't want to or can't understand you. And when that message comes through your actions instead of your words, the effect is completely different, because an absence that requires no explanation hurts far more than any argument ever could. If he cares, he'll feel it. If he doesn't, his distance will only confirm what your words could never change. When someone hurts you and you react immediately, crying, demanding answers, seeking explanations, asking to be acknowledged, you're operating from the most vulnerable place in your emotional world. That's completely understandable, completely human, but it often doesn't produce the healing effect you're hoping for. In fact, in many situations, it reinforces the imbalance in the relationship. The more visible your need becomes, the more indifference it can generate in him. That's why silence isn't a cowardly retreat. It's a strategic choice. It's the decision not to hand someone else control over your emotions at a moment when you're already exposed. It isn't coldness or indifference. It's self-care. And distance isn't a punishment. It's the space you need to reconnect with yourself, to recover the center that's been displaced by disappointment or confusion. This kind of silence is different from the silence born of anger or manipulation. It's an inhabited, mature silence, one that doesn't wait for a response, but observes. It's a silence that says, I'm here, but I'm not emotionally available for a connection that fractures me. When you withdraw, when you stop sending messages, when you stop showing up as someone still waiting for an explanation, something shifts in the usual dynamic. The person who used to count on your reaction, your persistence, your need, suddenly faces emptiness. And it's in that emptiness that the emotional truth reveals itself. If you matter to him, he'll move closer. If you don't, he'll use that space to drift further away, and meanwhile, from your silence, you'll have already begun reclaiming your strength. In this context, silence isn't passivity. It's a quiet act of reconnecting with yourself. It's the moment you stop chasing the other person and start returning to you. And even though it might not seem like it, that has far more transformative power than any words spoken from a place of pain. When pain takes over, the first thing that disappears is clarity. You feel swept up by an internal current of intense emotion, sadness, indignation, emptiness, the desire for him to understand what he's caused inside you. It's easy to react out of urgency, but that's exactly where you can do yourself the most harm. Through my work, I've come to recognize 3 psychic movements that don't just protect you, they hand your power back to you. The first is conscious emotional pause. Before any outward action, there's an inner stillness. This is the moment where you do nothing. And paradoxically, that doing nothing is itself an act of clarity. It means not reacting on impulse, not sending voice messages full of pain, not writing endless texts trying to explain what he isn't willing to understand, not begging for attention disguised as conversation. Instead, you let the emotion move through you without taking over your behavior. You cry, you breathe, you write in a journal about what hurts, you walk in silence, you listen to yourself without judgment. That pause is the first affirmation of your worth. You decide when and how to act, not your wound. The second movement is tactical, protective disappearance. This one is deeply misunderstood by anyone still living inside relationships built on emotional dependency. Disappearing isn't punishment, it isn't coldness, and it certainly isn't a power game. It's a dignified retreat. You step away from whoever hurt you, not to create longing, but to recover your own presence within yourself. You reduce contact to a minimum, silence notifications, avoid situations where you'd feel emotionally exposed, and give yourself time and space. Because as long as you stay available to someone who has hurt you, you're sending an unconscious message that your pain doesn't matter that much, that you can still be reached even in your vulnerability. And that weakens your emotional integrity. The third movement is redirecting your vital energy. All the energy you were pouring into that relationship now needs new places to go. This isn't about distracting yourself with superficial things at all. Ask yourself, how long has it been since you slept well? What parts of your life did you stop showing up for while you waited for messages that never came? Pick up a book again, take a walk with no destination, reconnect with your body through movement or dance. Take care of how you eat. Not with rigidity, but with kindness toward yourself. All of these are symbolic ways of telling yourself, I'm coming back to me. And when you return to yourself, he stops being the center of your world. None of this asks you to suppress your pain or pretend to be strong. What I'm offering you is a way to protect the place from which you choose to respond to what hurts you, because from that place, you can rebuild without giving away your dignity in the process. When you step back, it's possible he'll come back, driven by guilt, ego, shallow regret, or simply because he's lost control over your reactions. In that sudden return, your first instinct might be relief, to see him, to hear him, to feel like you need him. But this is the most critical moment to act not from emotion, but from observation. Before you respond, create some inner stillness and ask yourself, did he feel your absence because he truly values you, or because he felt he was losing his emotional hold over you? Watching his actions, not his words, is the most strategic step you can take. Because remorse that repeats but never changes isn't healing, it's repetition. If he acknowledges his mistakes without you having to push him to, if he respects your boundaries without you having to remind him, if he shows real, honest willingness to rebuild, that can be a genuine new beginning, as long as the changes are real, respectful, and consistent. But if his return comes wrapped in empty promises, justified offenses, or calculated silences, then you're standing in front of the same cycle, just dressed differently. Here's the principle I keep coming back to: love without slipping back into the role of victim. If he comes back, watch how he comes back, and notice what he's actually offering beyond words. If all he has is promises with no action, if he returns without having learned anything from the pain he caused, if he asks for your forgiveness while continuing the same pattern, don't go back. Because your value doesn't lie in saving an unfinished relationship. It lies in protecting your integrity. You can love without disappearing. You can offer a second chance without giving up your boundaries. And if he chooses to stay, let it come from a place of real respect, not from artificial need. Only then will you know you're not just accepting his return. You're affirming your own choice. If you decide to give the relationship another chance after his return, that renewed space has to come from inner strength, not emotional urgency. This isn't about going back to a relationship you already knew wasn't holding you, hoping that this time will somehow be different. It's about rebuilding yourself first, from your values and your dignity, and only then allowing for the possibility of rebuilding together if he's truly willing to grow with you. That rebuilding starts with defining your emotional standards clearly. It's not just about hearing "I'm sorry." It's about watching how he behaves after breaking your trust. Does he respect your boundaries without you having to remind him? Does he show up with real, consistent actions instead of more words? Does he have the humility to acknowledge his mistakes without turning it into a drama and without excuses? That's the minimum standard for considering a fresh start on that emotional ground. But it also means staying true to yourself. Don't slip back into the role of emotional caretaker that wore you down. Don't become the one who forgives, justifies, and waits indefinitely, because love can never be an excuse to erase your needs or silence what you truly require. If he comes back, let it be to be a partner, not to pick back up an unequal dynamic. Taking care of yourself in this stage means looking at your life with fresh attention. Are you moving forward emotionally, or are you stuck in a cycle of hope with no foundation? Are you honoring your own pace or falling back into the rhythm he sets? Notice whether your self-care habits, sleeping well, eating with attention, moving your body, protecting your emotional space, grow stronger or fade away depending on whether he's around. If you notice he's repeating old patterns, avoiding responsibility for his actions, not respecting the boundaries you've built, then there's no rebuilding to be done, only illusion. And even though loving him might hurt, you're not here to rescue an unfinished story. You deserve a connection that adds to your wholeness, not one that consumes it. Conscious rebuilding means moving forward, not backward. It means saying, if you're going to be part of my life, you come with real consistency, clear awareness, and sustained action. If you can't meet that, there's no room for you in my emotional world. This isn't about demanding perfection. It's about real emotional accountability. And if he wants to stay, let it be because he can show up for you without you having to settle, because your story doesn't end with what he chose not to learn. Your story continues through your commitment to protect your own worth. And that commitment, once it takes root, is what truly builds love with you. Not love for the person you wish he were, but love from someone who genuinely chooses to be there. After a deep emotional wound, many women feel the pull to rebuild by returning to the same relationship, hoping that this time it will be different. But recognizing that you can't go back to that place anymore, that's a sense of liberation. If you choose to stay and work on the relationship, do it with clear standards. But more important than anything else is returning to yourself, reconnecting with everything you set aside, your projects, the things you forgot about, your dreams. That return to yourself becomes real the moment you decide you're no longer going to pour your emotional energy into someone who never held it before. Every small daily action becomes an act of repair. Drinking your coffee in silence, knowing you are enough. Choosing an outfit that makes you feel like yourself without needing anyone's approval. Listening to music that moves you without needing to prove anything to anyone. Nurturing friendships that affirm your worth without conditions. In that process of returning to yourself, you move through real grief. You can cry deeply for what was, without turning that grief into a reason to stay somewhere that no longer respects you. You can honor your emotional history while opening the door to a new chapter. One where being whole makes you the protector of your own story, not a shadow of someone else's. And once that inner care stops being occasional and becomes a rhythm, something transformative happens. You no longer need someone else's reflection to validate your effort. You no longer depend on his attention to know you're standing strong. Whether someone stays or leaves no longer defines you. Your worth rests in your consistency, in your self-respect, in the presence you give yourself. Setting a boundary isn't building a wall against love. It's building a barrier against being worn down. It's not closing yourself off to possibility. It's filtering, with clarity, what kind of connection actually deserves your presence. Reaffirming your boundaries doesn't mean rejecting someone else. It means putting yourself first in a world that has often taught you to put yourself last. For years, maybe you've learned that love is measured by how much you can endure, how much you justify, how long you wait. But there comes a turning point where you realize it's no longer about enduring. It's about choosing. Not everything that feels intense is love. Sometimes it's attachment. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's habit, dressed up as passion. That's why your boundaries also serve as a way of evaluating the quality of a connection. And that's when your silence stops being emptiness and becomes affirmation. When your distance stops being punishment and becomes consequence. When your dignity stops being negotiable. He might be thrown off. He might try to reopen doors that no longer lead to the same dynamic. But this time, you're not waiting for him to react the way you want. You're watching whether he can exist within the new emotional territory you're building. This isn't about him realizing what he lost. It's about you realizing what you're no longer willing to give away. Your energy, your time, your peace. Because when you stop debating your worth with someone who doesn't know how to hold it, everything changes. The boundary stops being a wall and becomes a compass, one that points you toward connections that nourish you, not ones that wear you down. When a woman finds herself constantly explaining, justifying, or trying to make someone understand why their actions were hurtful or disrespectful, it's time to pause and look clearly. Are you really being heard, or are you filling the silence of someone's emotional absence with your own need to be understood? The desire to be understood is valid, but constantly trying to convince someone who shows no willingness to truly see you is a quiet form of emotional exhaustion. And the most painful part is that, far from creating empathy, exposing your pain over and over often only reinforces the other person's indifference. This is where something transformative becomes possible. Stop talking to someone who doesn't want to listen and start listening to yourself. Your worth doesn't need defending, and it doesn't need arguments. Your worth lives in how you care for yourself, in the dignity of how you walk away, in your choice not to remain somewhere you're diminished, dimmed, or dismissed. A woman who stands in her own center doesn't beg for clarity. She doesn't negotiate with ambiguity. She doesn't plead for validation. Her presence alone speaks a quiet truth. I value myself, even if you don't. And that conviction carries far more power than any emotional speech ever could. You're not here to prove your love to anyone. You're not here to beg to be seen or to turn affection into something you have to win. You're here to be yourself, with everything that includes your boundaries, your silences, your firm decisions, and your right to leave without explanation when mutual respect is gone. When you stop arguing your case, your real freedom begins. Because someone who truly values you doesn't need convincing. They recognize it from the first moment, and they stay not out of pressure but out of presence. When you decide to break the silence and ask questions, it's not to hurt or provoke unnecessary conflict. It's to reconnect with your own voice. Because if there's one certainty, it's that nothing can move forward if you don't let yourself speak about what's broken. Asking from your center is a way of staying true to yourself, even if the other person has no real interest in answering honestly. You ask not expecting his answer to heal anything, but to listen to your own reaction. What does your body tell you when you ask the question? What happens in your chest while you wait for a response that never comes? What does your skin tell you when he looks away or answers with irritation? These aren't accusations. They're an internal compass helping you find your way. Don't expect his answer to fix the relationship. What you're really trying to understand is whether the relationship is worth repairing at all. Ask yourself things like, are you staying out of comfort or out of real value? Are you afraid of losing something that's already taking your peace? Are you willing to walk forward with respect? Or are you settling for a connection with no real commitment? These questions don't need an answer out loud. Sometimes just letting them sit in the air is enough to break the repeating script. And if what comes back isn't pain, recognition, or calm, but avoidance, blame, or contempt, then you know there's no foundation for another chapter. The issue was never what he said, it's how he responds to your truth. Because in that moment, you realize you're not trying to trap him in a contradiction. You're rediscovering yourself through the question itself. Are you staying in the emotional silence of someone who doesn't see you? Or are you choosing to listen to yourself with the certainty that your question doesn't need an answer, only respect? In so many unbalanced relationships, the mistake isn't only in accepting the pain, it's in turning that pain into a tool for demanding change or explanations someone was never going to give. That dynamic may feel logical, but it has invisible limits. The moment your power depends on his willingness to change, you've handed him the compass to your own emotional world. This is where a different kind of strength is born. It isn't a request. It isn't forced. It doesn't come from a place of complaint. It comes from inside, from the certainty that you don't need to change anyone in order to remain whole. It's the strength that shows up when you choose to walk away without guilt, when you stop justifying behavior that hurt you, when you decide you deserve more than an inconsistent connection dressed up as possibility, when you can remember it all without resentment, only with clarity. That no longer has a place in my life because it no longer reflects who I am. I don't surround myself with people who can't hold space for my truth. That's where your real emotional power lives. A power that doesn't demand, doesn't judge, but also no longer tolerates what you once accepted while wearing yourself down to justify it. Because some loves teach you what you're no longer willing to repeat. And some silences, some retreats, some decisions aren't endings. They're revelations of who you are now. Without needing to explain it, that choice speaks for itself.